I think now we can move to the next stage, which is inviting the reviewers to make their comments on the presentations. Basically, I think each reviewer will make comments, and then each reviewer has 5 minutes to make comments, and then the presenters have 2 minutes each to respond to those comments. I think you don't have to respond to everything. I think you can pick the most important thing to respond to, and then not the rest. And I would also encourage others to type in the chat box your thoughts about the presentations. Thank you. So I invite else. Would you like to go first?
Okay, yes, I was asked to comment on the paper of Rob Shields, so I will focus on that. So the presentation, it was a kind of elaboration, as I saw it, of some topics and concepts on the impact of the COVID pandemic on public space, and especially also private space, and how the border between the two are shifting. And so the concept of the keynote speaker, the multi-scalar thinking, as Kim Dovey called it, is also present in the paper. And you jump from the bigger scale, where you explain the donut concept of the empty city center and the business district that is empty, while the periphery and the peri-urban zones are important places where people live but also work. And then you jump to that scale, to the more almost interior architecture scale, on how the home functions as a place where work, family life, and virtual space interferes with each other. That's how I read your paper. On the one hand, I would like you to reflect more on the scales and the interaction between these scales. So how do you connect the change in the city on urban level with then what happens with the micro process in the home? And also you are inspired by gender. You refer to a study on gender space, etc. How can you reflect on gendering in the home, as it was a topic that often it's the domain of women, and public space, as the second reader Tine Pot argued, is a place still often designed by men and initially also used by men. The women who were in public women, they have another connotation. So what are the implications on gender in the change in the home, as well as on the urban level? For example, I remember some of the articles during the COVID pandemic period in which couples were having difficulties, that the children were noisy and men were like, oh, I need to work. It's the woman's task to keep the children quiet. Why, of course, when they went to relation therapist who said, okay, but what is your work? They both had work. So the children were both extra work for both of them. But in general thinking, you saw that the wife was seen responsible for caring for the children and also behaving them, what you called sonic atmosphere, so that it's not too noisy. And then finally, a question on, you bring in some philosophers like Hannah Arendt, Michel Foucault, and Machiavelli to describe the political economy, the contract and self-mastery and discipline of subjects. Can you bring them in your conclusion again? How are these concepts still relevant, or how did they change by the COVID pandemic? So these are my questions.
Thank you, Els, for taking a very short time to ask the question. I think the critical question there is about gender. So because the presentation was very clear on the other aspects, perhaps you may want to respond to that, Rob Shields.
Thanks. You want responses one by one, I guess. Sure. Thank you very much. That's a very clear reading of the paper, and Yeah, I think the most interesting thing, as you made very clear, is the way in which the boundary work of organizing these, how these domains conflict or sit alongside each other in this condition of saturation and kind of colonizing the home by digital platforms and work activities. You make very clear that it tends to fall to women. So we have a new domain of gendered labor, and furthermore, it's boundary work. And this is a very important contribution from organization studies and the sociology of science, looking at just how, for example, these two different forms of organizations, different, say, work culture and social culture, how they're managed to come together. So I think that's added on to the tendency still for women to be left in charge of child rearing, and so having to confront the problem of childcare, but also who's supervising children who are supposedly doing homework or attending class online, or something, some days online and some days not. So it's a very fluid situation. And I think in that context, there's a loss of any possibility of mastery of the household in the way that Machiavelli or Xenophon spoke about the prince governing his own household, the court, and by extension, the population. So that kind of line of thinking in Western politics and government is really challenged by these dynamic conditions. So I think that there are challenges for that kind of vision of patriarchal masculinity as well. I don't have all the, I don't have a kind of like a pat answer and problem solved. I think it is an agenda where more research is required, and I think it has implications for the masculine gendered construction of urban public spaces as well. Lots of work to be done, and lots of new domains, I think, to be added on to planning, architecture, public service delivery, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. I was waiting to hear whether you thought men were emasculated by being locked down in the home and then taking on some of the roles, sharing some of the roles that they've always left to women in the home. But anyway, that's a discussion we can continue elsewhere. So the next reviewer is Dr. Rashid Bouyan. So welcome.
Thank you. I like the presentations, the visuals, that Tina has shared. Means after reading the chapter that I had. Well, I reviewed the Tini's article on Beyond the Great Empty, the future of the post-COVID city and its public interiors. So the visuals were really appealing to me, and after reading the paper, after reading the paper, I really liked it. It was a pleasure reading. The authors focus on the three key aspects, or I would say problematized three key aspects of public interiors. I name them as dualities, instances, and dynamics. So on dualities, the authors has talked about interiority and exteriority of transition spaces. Distances, they problematize the public interiors and as spaces of new proximity. And dynamics, the public interiors as transition spaces, spaces of appearance and with others. And with this framing with theoretical lens from urbanist, including Walter Benjamin, and also at the same time Edward Hall and Arendt's, and all these perspectives that are shared. And also the cases that has been shared are quite compelling. That makes the case of this problem. It validates those problematization in the post-COVID time. I particularly liked the idea of transition space, and also the flexibility in use that has been highlighted during the after this COVID period, and also the problems that we are going through in this new time after the pandemic. So the authors also mentioned the commentaries with relevant examples and case descriptions that lead to timely questions, as in the later part of the paper, that will we observe changes in the layout and regulations of public interiors? That caught my eyes, that these questions is compelling. Whether some questions, some answers can come in this direction from those narratives. That is one question that came to my mind. But this is a very timely questions that the authors come to. And at the same time, regarding the discussions of flexibility, so for example, a paradigm shift in thinking about program emerges, the author says, I'm quoting, from the monofunctional programs predominantly focused on consumption to unprogrammed frameworks for public life. So what Kim has shared, for example, the precedents come, the questions from urban design perspective we ask, is it from the ground or is it from the top? The question to me is not precedence or not the preference, is the how to integrate, because we know that the cities are being programmed and informality, the formality needs to be discussed together. At least I'm talking from Singapore. So where the city is planned, each and every inch is planned on by the authorities, for example, then how informality grows and those unprogrammed can be facilitated. But during the COVID, for example, we have seen that this has been the case, that many of the cases that the authors have shared are demands new thinking in terms of program. So my questions that emerge from in that direction, that whether the paper build up on some more that what urban designers can do to integrate these unprogrammed frameworks for public life. Means what does this mean in practice? So maybe I'm highlighting that if the paper goes a bit towards the implications in urban design from the discussions, might be beneficial as well to get some more direction beyond the critique, and also whether it includes some of those theoretical perspectives that has been discussed, but they were pre-pandemic, for example. So the question emerged that which of these gives some inputs to the new conditions. So what I'm saying is some implications in the discussions might be, whether any thoughts in that direction. Yeah, thank you. I will end here.
Thank you very much. Tina left the room a short while ago. She said she had some commitments, but she had asked that the comments be referred to Else. So Else, might you want to respond? Because Else, you are her promoter.
Maybe it's I want to frame the research because that will also explain how the public interior is approached. Tina is on the one hand an interior architect, and on the other hand an urban planner. So she did an extra master. And we noticed that in interior architecture, there is a movement from the inside, from the home to the public space and to the public interior. And so her question was, how can interior architects contribute and also develop a methodology to deal with the public interior, the public space, from an interior architecture perspective to design urban furniture, for example, but also another environments. And that's maybe why she makes a bit artificial division between, on the one hand, how the user experiences the spaces, so from below, and on the other hand, how planners often plan cities and design, and especially then in the Western world, design cities, plan cities, and have a top-down approach. And of course, you have exceptions when I think about Jane Jacobs and so on, where she has also an eye for the user, but it's a fight to have that at least in the Western worlds. And so I think many of the questions on on her approach. Should planners not look to the user more, and informal use of public space is something that is really the specialty from interior architects, who start from the relation of the body with the direct environment and with objects in the space and how objects are placed in spaces and so on. But of course, as the keynote speaker already said, we have an interscalar thinking, and I think it comes back in many of the presentations that are given here. Also in the one of Rob Shields, he's not an interior architect, but how he describes how the camera blurs the interior, it's really an interior observation on that level, what happens with the interior.
Thank you very much, Els. I think I want to invite the next reviewer, which is Nurul Rahman Khan, to comment perhaps on Min's presentation, I suppose.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk on Min's presentation, Boring Public Space Livelihoods on the Pavement of Hanoi, Vietnam, before and during the COVID-19 crisis. The presentation gave us a wonderful idea of the street vendors and the street life and the spaces they occupy on the street in Hanoi. However, that is almost very similar to many parts of South Asia or Southeast Asia. So I think what the paper needs to do is maybe really put Hanoi into context, and also put those street vendors and those localities into a context. What I feel missing in the paper is that when the neighborhood is described, is where those neighborhoods are, how they interact with other parts of the city, because that is what will really bring out the differences of the placements of those spaces in respect to other cities. I think that is a little important to see the context of those areas of observation in relation to neighborhoods, business districts, or are they connected to certain connection points between those places and so on. So that is one of my observations on the paper. The other one was that there was a wonderful insight on how different rules were made by the government and how different negotiations took place during the COVID time in order to allow people or not to allow people to perform on those streets, to have that, to occupy those places, to sell, to be there. So what we can probably, the paper can do is try to find a way that there is a possibility of these negotiations, and to establish some ideas as how in a post-pandemic situation, those negotiations could give rise to a new arrangement of those spaces, rather than just to have the idea of having those spaces once and then having that change during the COVID time. But to look at those spaces in a post-pandemic era, and to find out if certain clues can be taken from the negotiations that were done by the government, the localities, by the people who allowed those people to set up shops in those areas. And I think that is interesting, because it brings, when we looked at the first presentation, we saw all these negotiations that took place in terms of how people occupy street. So I think that is something that the paper can add, where these, when in South Asian countries where the negotiations are very complex, where you deal with the local policemen, you deal with the local, I don't know, maybe even the thugs, sometimes with the people in houses in front of which you are trying to occupy. So once we've seen that the possibility of that is there, and certain structure of these informal people who occupy these spaces can be achieved, can we find a way, can the paper propose on some ideas of how that could be a clue of how to plan these spaces in the future? So I think that would be very, very interesting. The other thing that I wanted to point out in the paper is, there's a chapter which starts out by saying, resilience, coexistence, and sympathies. So, you know, when you, that I think is a wonderful insight in how a new occupancy of the street can be imagined. So I think a little bit of reimagining, a little bit of post-COVID scenario could come into the paper's, you know, a structure, and that would really make it, I think, stronger. The other thing is that, you know, when you are talking about stakeholders, I think that is something that we've seen in some other papers. Also, the informal, who are the stakeholders in an informal settlement or informal occupancy of the street. I think in one paper, there was a wonderful title called Social Capital. And that is something which is also interesting to understand, is how when we talk about stakeholders, how these stakeholders should or can invest on this social capital in order to reimagine space, not just the construct itself. So I think with those, I think that I just would leave it and give this platform back to you guys. Thank you.
So, Min, would you like to respond? You have very little time to do so.
Thank you very much for that comment and feedback, Nurul. I really appreciate it. There are lots of things that we should look at the public space in either developing or developed worlds and see how it can be better designed. And clearly, I believe the ways in which the public realms in the developing world context provide lessons to the developed world context, to the developed world city to learn from. The way in which we've seen the public space as a ground for negotiation, it allowed different kind of people from different social economic class to come in and to say, that is my city. I acknowledge the comments and feedback you gave, particularly on sharpening the context and highlight the uniqueness of the context. But I also want to generalize it in a way that it could be somehow represent an Asian urbanisms rather than just the thing that happens in Hanoi. I'm also very interested in the comments and the way you highlight the roles of stakeholder and the roles of social capitals, and I think that is very important. That's a kind of thing that Southeast Asians residents are highly evaluated, because they can't necessarily exist without having other people exist around them or collaborate with other people. So I think it's very interesting, and I'll try to elaborate on that. I'm lucky enough to actually co-produce one of the space in Melbourne in developed world context that that Kim did mention. We make the parklets on the street. We demonstrate how we as a university staff and also a very normal people in Melbourne can actually create a space using our own monies and create our own space for people to play. That kind of playful public space is produced, showing that, look, people can help making the city better, can help making the street better, can demonstrate how the street can be better designed and created for people and by people. Thank you very much for your comments and feedbacks. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Min. We have a final reviewer, and that is Tanzil Shafiq. Dr. Tanzil Shafiq, I presume she is making comments on Israel's presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, we can.
All right. So I'm commenting on the the right to adapt post-pandemic change of illegal settlements. I mean, I can actually read what I wrote, but I don't want to do that because I feel like as the last one, I feel like it would be good if I can thread through some of the points across. So the first thing that I noticed, it's mentioned very offhanded way, but I think this is one of the key insights of the paper, that the authors talk about how the informal settlements was a problem no matter what form of governance regime or what form of ideology there was in place. So it's like a socialist country, they still have the problem with the informal settlements. You become, more capitalist, and then still is a problem. So for me, that constant pariah of the informality against kind of like governance or formal governance, that's something quite interesting. So this actually brings in mind the notion that economist J.K. Galbraith talked about, how oftentimes while we may think of socialist and capitalist systems diametrically opposed, in terms of decision making and certain key regulatory decision making, they might be very centralized. And informal settlements, and not just settlements, but imagine when in Min's presentation, these street traders, there is a very distributed form of decision making, which is quite oppositional to both capitalist and communist or socialist mode of governance, where certain key aspects are decided at the center. So I don't know if that helps that conceptual insight, but that was something that I noticed. But I think, of course, the central the proposition of the paper, which is the notion of the capacity of the informality to adapt, to undergo adaptation in the face of COVID-19 crisis. This to me interesting is because it's put in relation to social capital. And what would be interesting to, one thing that I felt was a bit missing is, Hernan de Soto's work is often absolutely criticized because, de Soto worked with very right think, the kind of like a political right. So he worked with World Bank, and he has a very, so the ones on the left, let's say Ananya Roy or Mike Davis, they would criticize the De Soto version of the heroic entrepreneurism, which kind of like says, oh no, this is not a problem, informality is the solution. So I mean, there is a foil to that, and I think it would be interesting if the paper kind of like commented on how their findings or the author's findings actually was going beyond that notion of a romanticized or celebratory tone of informality. Because of course, I think this, Kim would just say this, I think, as well, because we're at that point where we're really going beyond this dichotomies, this binaries of social and spatial and the formal and the informal. So it would be good to comment on that, because I thought that was really interesting. On that note, actually, for me, another point was the very distinctively different urban morphologies and what it affords. Because you start to realize that the morphology of the city, that is what already holds different sets of potential that people may or may not use. So for example, someone in the 15th floor has no option to go out and do some farming. But on the other hand, someone in the slopes has that potential. Now, that to me is a morphological character. And I think this is what something Kim was trying to point at the end, where he was trying to show the assemblage diagram and saying that, there is a social constructedness, there is social capital in terms of what Putnam talked about, the network of relationships and trust that people have, or, how those gets activated. But there is a, very materialist sense, like almost a morphological sense of, potentiality that cities already have. So for me, this would be really interesting if the authors drive home this point, that we can really see what the theoretical purchase of the paper is. It points towards the social no longer as purely a social you know, as opposed to the spatial, because the spatial is integrated within the social, because the spatial, the morphology of the city, it kind of like gives certain aspects. I mean, it just produces different sets of affordance. So if we, you know, that's another aspect, that another theory that I would suggest the authors to look at, affordance by Gibson, because I think this just takes the paper in a very theoretical direction, because it just gives a lot of things to think with, you know, particularly going back to the title, Reimagining Public Space. I mean, we can only reimagine things when we have a very different ontology. So I'm really interested in, you know, rethinking some of the binary notions that we're so used to saying, like top down and bottom up. I mean, at least in my research in informal settlements in Dhaka, it did not make sense at all. Like there was, you know, it was so you know, the entanglement between the top down and bottom up. By the time I finished my PhD, I could no longer speak of what was the bottom up and what was the top down. So I think this is a really interesting paper in that regard, because it's really pointing towards that. And I think across all the papers that I saw today, there is this, you know, thread that brings all of it together, that it points towards the complexity, points towards the relationalities, and points towards the simple dichotomous thinking, a point beyond that. So for me, that's really interesting. And yeah, that's my comment on the paper.
Yeah, thank you, Tanzil.
I hope that Isra, my rant is useful some way.
so Isra, you can give a short response on one of the aspects raised.
Thank you for the comment. First of all, I actually in Sarajevo we have the process which is called legalization. We didn't mention it in the paper, and I agree that it's very important, because we don't have like this power of the state who is going to give the power to the people, so they don't have rights. And this illegal is not it's not romanticized in a way, because it's really it starts from bottom up, but it ends like a top-down decision. So it's kind of that our state is watching illegal settlement, and it's growing, and in one point they are legalizing it. So in that case, everybody who builds everything they have, they actually gain rights at one point. So it's not just that they have just the built houses and no rights, they have the opportunity also to have rights. So this is maybe we didn't mention, and it's really important actually. Do you want to come?
Yeah, just to add something. Even so, it seems as if in formalities we have like plan is the general urban plan is informal kind of. It's when you make a survey between with decision makers inside the city, you will get this kind of feeling that they tolerate informal settlements because it's part of their plan, kind of. It's very much connected with political power, because this term legalization that they use when they give legal papers to the people who built informal houses on the slopes is act of corruption, kind of, because they are buying votes during the election. And so, especially after the war here in Bosnia, it became kind of informality became a system. Basically,
I hate to interrupt you. I mean, this discussion is actually so interesting, both in terms of events and also in terms of sort of different underlying theories for multiple domains. But I do have to, because our time is up. No, there's nothing to be. Thank you both. Thank all 8 of you for really interesting talks and discussions. We have an embarrassment of riches. The the rich part is the discussion, but we're penalized that we don't get to go to GatherTown. So we can do that tomorrow or another time.